in 2008 when Myanmar was hit by Cyclone Nargis, which was massive, because I accompanied the head of USAID and the head of the Pacific Command at that point from Utapao into Yangon to offer help to the then military government. They initially refused, but then came around and allowed assistance. I think so. I think the problem on this time around is twofold. One, that the Trump administration has largely dismantled USAID. So even if we had a huge opening, it's hard to imagine that the U.S. could launch that sort of effort like it did in 2004 or even 2008. Second, then you have the problem of the military junta, which is frankly, a horrible group of generals with a long track record of restricting aid or using it for their own purposes. So you would have a real challenge working with them under any circumstances.
As someone, Ambassador, who has seen the highs and lows of this country, what is your gut reaction to this earthquake that is hitting at such a precarious time? And do you see this as potentially a turning point in the civil war?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, my first reaction is this is a country that's already suffered 4 years of massive conflict in the aftermath of the military coup in 2021. You've got 2 to 3 million people displaced even before the earthquake. So it's a disaster on top of an already disastrous situation. Going forward, I'm reluctant to make too many predictions because this could go any number of ways. I think both the military and the resistance groups fighting against it will try to take advantage of the earthquake if they can to gain some military advantage. But I would be surprised, honestly, if this led to some kind of breakthrough in negotiations because this is a real zero-sum situation politically. You have a military that absolutely refuses to give up power, and a population, the overwhelming majority of which desperately wants that military out of power because it's such a horrible and brutal regime. So I have a hard time seeing, even with a disaster of this magnitude, that this somehow leads to a breakthrough in peace. I hope it does somehow, but I'm not holding my breath.
In your mind then, as you say, disaster upon a disaster, what would be the longer term risks if it isn't met with both robust and sustained support for the people, also for regional and economic stability?
Yeah, well, I think there should be a major international effort to help. And I think there's two angles to it. One is because the military only controls some parts of the country. So you've got to work through organizations in areas not controlled by the military. That's certainly possible, particularly through Thailand, to get assistance to people who've been hard hit, for example, in Sagaing regime to the north, Sagaing region to the north of the country. In terms of working with the military, some governments already are. The problem is that military, as I said, they won't hesitate to use the aid for their own purposes and to restrict its flow. They've already, blocked foreign media from going in to report on what's going on. So I'm not saying don't go and work with the military at all, but you have to do it very carefully and with lots of assurances that you're going to have access to the people who really need the aid.
Yeah, and I guess on that point, we are hearing these anecdotal reports that aid distribution is very chaotic in the country, concerns that the military is hampering in those efforts. What can be done by international actors, given the context here of a civil war, to kind of, address these issues?
Well, this military is very hard to reason with. Because they don't fundamentally care about the people. And so they don't really care if a bunch of people suffer, to put it very bluntly. The governments that would have the most influence vis-a-vis the military regime in terms of pushing them to allow unrestricted flows of aid to those who need it would be China, and Myanmar's ASEAN neighbors, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the like. I would hope that they would be speaking very strongly to the generals saying, look, we want to help, but you can't have the restrictions that you've had in the past and that you seem to be imposing right now. But it's going to be tough because these generals don't really compromise.
Ambassador, very quickly before we let you go, I mean, one issue is obviously Myanmar's been sanctioned and also frozen out by the West, so that's sort of driven them into China's arms. And I understand the relationship, right? It's very, very pragmatic. Both sides need each other. They don't love each other, right? I'm sure you know that more than anybody else. But in the aftermath of this quake, after we get through it and start thinking about reconstruction and just moving on from this, is it almost inevitable that Myanmar will have no choice but to go deeper into China's arms?
Well, I would put it this way. The regime, the military regime in power is depending somewhat on China, although they really don't like to depend on China, which is why they've also been working a lot with Russia. The public as a whole, though, isn't leaning that way at all. The public as a whole doesn't want most of the world working with the military junta, which they regard rightly as completely illegitimate and not having much control over the country. So I think it's extremely complicated in that sense. And again, I think reconstruction and rebuilding, even if you wanted to work with the military junta, they only control part of the country, and their economic mismanagement is infamous. So I think you do everything you can to get aid to the people in need. I think long-term reconstruction is going to require a political resolution, which I think we're still far away from.